Hey everyone, welcome to the mini lecture for Act 3 of Macbeth by William Shakespeare. Before I begin, make sure that you're reviewing your notes every day, not just cramming before a test or something like that, because trust me, it doesn't help. Make sure you're taking more notes. We're in the middle of the play now with Act 3, and this is where a lot of big important things happen. And finally, dash ones, if you have not begun your research, you should begin it now. It is going to take a lot of time, and it always helps to make sure that you are on top of things. Without further ado, let's begin. Alright, so some time has passed in Scotland at the beginning of Act 3, but as we'll soon find out, it hasn't been all that great under the rule of King Macbeth. In the meantime though, we check in with Banquo, who totally knows what Macbeth did. After all, he was there for the prophecies, and he can read between the lines, as he muses to himself, "Thou hast it now, King Cawdor Glamis all, as the weird women promised, and I fear thou playedst most foully for it." However, even though Shakespeare has set up Banquo as an honorable foil for our corrupted protagonist, it's important to note that even as he suspects Macbeth's foul deeds, he also acknowledges that it must also mean that his prophecies will come true, showing how ambition hits all of us. The difference is in how we act upon it. In any case, Banquo is about to go on a quick ride with his son Fleance before a banquet that the king and queen are hosting. Macbeth is acting quite suspicious here, as he mentions how Malcolm and Donalbain have been spreading nasty rumors about how it was actually Macbeth who killed Duncan and not them. He also makes a point of asking if Fleance will be joining his father on his ride. Once Banquo leaves, Macbeth sends everyone away, including Lady Macbeth, which is an interesting thing to note that we'll touch on in a bit. In the meantime, his next soliloquy shows us just how far he has fallen. His first two soliloquies dealt with his conflict over committing Duncan's murder, but now there is no conflict at all, as he offers no excuses for why he shouldn't murder Banquo and Fleance, but rather only reasons why he should. As he states, "To be thus is nothing but to be safely thus. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared." Macbeth acknowledges that Banquo is a better man than he, and even though Macbeth is king, he is not yet safe, as he too remembers Banquo's prophecies. Shakespeare's allusions to Mark Antony and Augustus Caesar reinforces this, as Mark Antony was a Roman general who sought control but was supposedly prophesied to lose it to the more worthy opponent, Augustus. Spoilers, the prophecy was right. We also tie back into what Lady Macbeth alluded to earlier in the play about how the Macbeths have no children. His declaration, "Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren scepter in my grip, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding." The fertility metaphor of fruitless and barren further emphasizes the fact that because he has no son of his own, then that means that his family's time as king ends with him. He then goes on to lament how he has murdered a good man, damned his soul to hell, and driven himself insane for Banquo's children. And really, how fair is that? All kidding aside though, Shakespeare uses this to show how Macbeth is not running from what he did or trying to excuse it in any way. Macbeth knows that what he did was terrible, and he will suffer for it and deserves to. However, this does introduce a key irony in Macbeth's character arc. For a guy who's relied on his own omens as validation and incentive for getting what he wanted and stoking his ambition, he is now challenging fate and doing everything in his power to thwart Banquo's prophecies. His meeting with the murderers further emphasizes this theme of taking control of your own destiny, or rather the question of whether or not we are able to. In order to convince them to murder Banquo and Fleance, he uses similar techniques as Lady Macbeth had in convincing him. However, instead of questioning their manhood in terms of courage, he questions it in terms of control. He has told them that it is the nobility, namely Banquo, that has kept them oppressed as lowly peasants. When they say that they are men and not beggars, Macbeth scoffs at them. "Aye, in the catalogue ye go for men, as hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, chops, water-rugs, and demi-wolves are clept all by the name of dogs." The metaphor is used to explain that just as there are different levels of dogs, from purebred to mutt, there are also different levels of humanity, and not all of them are treated as equals. This is a reference to the sociological belief of a great chain of being, believed by the Elizabethans and sadly still believed by many people to this day. It operated under the belief that your lot in life was predetermined by God, and if you didn't like it, then too bad. If you were born a poor farmer, then you better suck it up and do what your so-called betters told you to do. It wasn't their fault that you were born to be a beggar. Any deviation from this social hierarchy was considered unnatural and threw the established order into chaos. For example, a peasant could never become a noble, it just wasn't natural. We are actually seeing this with Macbeth's case as well. He became king through the unnatural means of killing Duncan, breaking the great chain. Because of this, nature is lashing out, as we saw at the end of the last act, and how it continues to be the case even now in Scotland, where the sun has not been out since. Macbeth is appealing to the murderers' own ambitions to rise above the station they were born into by any means necessary. Believe it or not, we still see this today in modern governments and politics, especially during elections. Watch any political ad or campaign, and more often than not, you'll see the politicians blame each other for how bad your life is, and how the only way to fix it is to side with them. It has led to many positive social movements throughout history, but also sadly some of the worst as well. In any case, Macbeth convinces them, though really they didn't have much choice, and Banquo and Fleance's fate is sealed, as is Macbeth's, at least in the audience's eyes. Whereas before, we may have been able to sympathize with his inner turmoil, the moment he coldly orders the execution of his best friend and his child, all that sympathy is gone. Macbeth is a full-on villain now. Scene 2 picks up these thematic threads even further. Lady Macbeth echoes her husband's statement in that they are far from safe, but also far from happy. Their guilt prevents them from even enjoying their newfound status. This is further reinforced when Macbeth brings back the motif of sleep, or lack thereof, by stating how Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. Treason has done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice domestic, foreign levy, nothing can touch him further. Duncan is in the eternal slumber, where he can no longer be harmed. The Macbeths, however, shall still sleep no more. We also get one of the most famous lines from the play as Macbeth laments how full of scorpions is my mind. To paraphrase Drake, the Macbeths made it to the top but aren't happy that they're here. The other interesting thing to note about this scene is how changed the relationship is between the two of them, and also how their roles have reversed. When Lady Macbeth asks her husband what he's going to do with Banquo, he doesn't tell her. Before, they were both in it to win it every step of the way, but now Macbeth is acting all on his own. Now, people over the centuries have tried to blame Lady Macbeth for forcing Macbeth to murder Duncan, which of course is completely ridiculous, but then again, so are people. Regardless, by having Macbeth act on his own, Shakespeare is showing us that Macbeth is the only one responsible for his choices. No one told him he had to murder Duncan to become king. He chose to do that, just as he is now choosing to murder Banquo and Fleance. We'll come back to this theme later, but regardless, Macbeth is willingly adding to his own damnation, as he ends the scene by declaring, "Things bad begun make strong themselves by ill." Scene 3 contains what appears to be a Shakespearean tradition, the death of a major character in Act 3. The two murderers from earlier are joined by a third at Macbeth's request. We're never given a reason as to why this murderer is added, or who it is. Some adaptations even have Macbeth join as the murderer himself. Personally, I like to think it's just to continue the motif of the number 3. 3 witches, 3 daggers, 3 murderers, but don't quote me on that. Long story short, Banquo dies, but Fleance escapes, and again, we're seeing Shakespeare infuse a lot of tragic irony into the plot. Remember, the reason that Macbeth even ordered these murders was to prevent Banquo's prophecies from coming true, and yet by doing so, he is seemingly ensured that they have. Banquo will now never be king himself, but because he stood between the murderers and Fleance, his son will. Banquo is not as happy as Macbeth in that he did not rise in station, but he died happier, relatively speaking, as he did not corrupt his mind or soul with evil deeds as Macbeth has done. And by failing to kill Fleance, as well as providing the boy a reason to seek revenge, he has all but guaranteed the succession of Banquo's line. Whereas before, we could question whether or not the witches were responsible for Macbeth's actions, now we are seeing that nowhere in the prophecies did they say how they would come true. Macbeth is the one forcing all of the action, and he is doing so in a very bad way. This paradox, whether the prophecies came true because that's how they were supposed to, or if they only came true because Macbeth made them come true, ties back into the tone and theme of chaos and uncertainty that Shakespeare introduced with fair is foul and foul is fair.
And don't worry about the vase.
What vase?
That vase.
I'm sorry.
I said don't worry about it. I'll get one of my kids to fix it.
How did you know?
Oh, what's really going to bake your noodle later on is, would you still have broken it if I hadn't said anything?
Scene 4 is the banquet scene, and as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth welcome in all the lords, the murderers give Macbeth the good news, bad news. Macbeth is peeved and frustrated at the fact that Fleance escaped, but brushes it off, saying that that's a problem for another day, as Fleance is no immediate threat. At this point, we get the ghost of Banquo. Macbeth is playing up his absence, saying how he wishes that Banquo could join them, when ironically he already has from a certain point of view. Macbeth sees the ghost sitting in his chair and freaks out, understandably. Now, the symbolism of this is pretty apparent, with the memory of Banquo sitting in the king's chair, and perhaps part of Macbeth realizes this as he screams at it. It is important to note, however, that no one else, not even Lady Macbeth, see this apparition. Lady Macbeth passes it off as a medical condition that Macbeth has had for years, but in the aside to her husband, it is clear that she is just as confused as the other lords. The fact that only Macbeth can see Banquo's ghost could mean a couple things. One, it truly is his ghost. We've already seen witches and prophecies, so it's not too far of a stretch to accept more supernatural doings. Or two, the image is a figment of Macbeth's tormented and fractured mind. He's already told us how his mind is full of scorpions and how he has not had a good sleep since Duncan's murder, so it could very well make sense that the ghost is a reflection of his own guilt. The fact that his murderous wife doesn't see it also makes sense, as she was not involved in Banquo's murder, and even she tells him that it's just like the imaginary dagger that Macbeth saw in Act 2. The argument could be made for either case, but it's interesting to think about. The ghost leaves and Macbeth recovers some composure, playing along with his wife by saying these fits are normal to him. But then the ghost comes back and he freaks right out again. His address to the ghost, however, is interesting and could further act as evidence that at the very least it has something to do with his guilt. When he cries, "Approach thou like the rugged Russian bear, the armed rhinoceros or the Hircian tiger, take any shape but that, and my firm nerves shall never tremble," he is essentially saying that he fears no beast or man, but only the image of his own terrible crimes. Again, much like all of us, it is always more difficult to face our own demons. As can be expected, this kind of kills the buzz of the party, and the lords all leave, leaving the Macbeths to figure things out. Macbeth gives another of his famous lines when he states, "It will have blood, they say. Blood will have blood," acknowledging that the dead will have their revenge one way or another. He then asks after Macduff, who was not present and seemingly ignored Macbeth's order to be there. We also learn that Macbeth has spies in all of the noble houses, playing up the idea that, as seen with his fears in Banquo, he has become increasingly paranoid. He then declares how he will return to the witches and demand more knowledge of the future, because, that worked so well last time. And again, playing into the blood motif, blood is in royalty, blood is in murder, blood is in family, you get the idea, we get another famous quote, "I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go over. They're in this bloody game too deep now, and there's no going back." Scene 5 wasn't actually written by Shakespeare, scholars believe, and most productions simply ignore it, which I'm glad of. It puts way too much emphasis on the witches being responsible for the tragedy, which cheapens the entire theme in my opinion. As such, we'll ignore it. Scene 6 finishes the act in the same way that Act 2 did, as a conversation between two minor characters on the state of Scotland. This time we have Lennox, who Shakespeare uses as a symbolic stand-in for the Scottish people. Through him, we hear about their displeasure with King Macbeth. Now, it's important to note that how you read this scene will impact your understanding of it. A straightforward, literal reading will lead readers to think that people genuinely feel like Malcolm, Donalbain, and Fleance are all father killers. We know that this isn't true, so the audience needs to realize that Lennox's dialogue is meant to be read through a tone of verbal irony. In other words, sarcastically. And anyway, if you take your time to read it closely, you pick that up regardless. And just in case you miss all that, Lennox confirms it by saying how he hopes that Macbeth never gets his hands on the royal princes. We also learn that Macduff, after ignoring Macbeth's summons to the banquet, strike 2, has also gone to England to find Malcolm and ask the English king for aid in reclaiming Scotland's throne. Macbeth found this out through his spies and sent a messenger to tell Macduff to get his butt back home, and you can probably guess how that went. Strike 3. Lennox ends the scene by voicing what everyone is thinking. Macbeth has become a bloodthirsty tyrant, and to disobey him is deadly. The last hope of Scotland now lies in Malcolm and Macduff.